Okay. Hello, everyone. Just a quick intro about me. Yes, my name is Fadila. I now work at Atlassian. Before, I was working with Chris and a few others in this room. So that's how we know each other. Um, yep. And the talk today is about where boundaries collide, ubiquitous language in the front end. So any front end developers in the room? 2, 3. Full stack? Okay, full stack counts, definitely. Full stack, yay, I love it. Okay, so yeah, hopefully this would shed some light into something. You'd take some value out of it. I'm also a first-time speaker. I have not spoken ever anywhere outside of a company. So this is definitely outside of my comfort zone. But thank you to those who have come here and given me an audience for I'm going to be famous one day, watch it. So you're going to go, wow, I saw her very first talk back in 2023 and you're going to be amazed. But yes, here we go. Here's the title. I hope you enjoyed the subtitle. I'm too ashamed to read it out loud. Did I just click? Did it work? Click? Yeah, I clicked. Okay, so a little bit of where I started as a software engineer. So all I saw were black screens and consoles and no light, basically. So in other words, I was a backend engineer. And in backend engineering, you don't see any boxes or buttons or screens of any sort, unless you're on Stack Overflow. But with this, like, little did I know it was a dream. So why was a dream? It was a dream because the language that we used in all of our backend services were clean. We used ubiquitous language. All of the models followed a very nice repeated usage of the same word. Minimal confusion between boundaries. So all of our boundaries were very nicely put together. Entities living happily, business logic using the right terminology. And because I was so used to this, I did not know what the outside world holds. Then I came to the light side of things, which is front-end development. Yay. So if you ask me to do back-end development or draw 25 unit cards, you know what I did 2 years ago. Picked up a whole deck. And what I discovered is that the front-end language was a mess. So this was within the same company. It was back at InLoop, working at the product. Oh, I'm not allowed to say that. You look and stalk my LinkedIn and you'll see it right there. And you'll be like, oh, that's what she was talking about. But coming from the back end to the front end, the language was a mess. So what does the mess mean? Models were being translated incorrectly. The same word in the back end became something completely different in the front end. Customers like to make up new words too, we realized eventually. And we didn't have proper designers, so the BAs would make up random content to chuck on the screen and would name our components to match what was on the screen and nothing to do with what the backend was telling us. So it was a big mumbo jumbo. And it was a lot of refactoring to try get it understandable for myself and any fellow engineers joining. And also what happened is when I joined the front end side of the code base, every other front end engineer left. So there was no one to kind of tell me what was happening. So it was a very big, fun adventure. I was in this mess for 1 year and then off I went. So an example, let's take the classic YouTube homepage. This may or may not be my suggested videos, so have fun looking at my interests. You can see that a simple web page doesn't look that simple once you start uncovering bits of it. So an example of how language can tangle up. Did you just say the word suggestions or recommendations? Have a think. A front-end engineer can go, yeah, just recommended videos, whereas the backend spat you out with an array of suggestions. But because the content said recommendations, what do you put on your component name? Toss a coin, right? So this happened a lot, but obviously not with YouTube. We weren't building YouTube. But so many different ways in our tests, in our components, in our API calls, data transformation, shoving into more components. The same problem persisted. The language was a mess. So to summarize the problem, back to our example. Yeah, so yeah, here is YouTube. This is an example. Is it clicking? Like I click? Okay. So the backends can have clear bounded contexts. In the previous company that I was at, yes, it was nearly clean, nearly squeaky clean. It was great. I had no problems understanding what each representation of a customer, a user, one of the services, what it was doing. It was all very clear in my brain. But the poor front end, there are subscriptions, there is search, there is accounts, notifications, suggested videos, everything to do with the video, the channel name, duration, the list goes on. And what comes with front ends is this is when you realize that a bunch of stakeholders suddenly have become more interested in things. So you have your designer, you have your customer, you have your content designer. Have you heard of that one? You have customer support that is helping your product. You have your product managers. Why are they suddenly so interested? It's because they could see these things on a screen, whereas before they could not. Right? It's open to the world to see. And what happens when you have all of these different languages come together? World domination. Whoa, the end of the world. So front ends are where boundaries collide. The boundaries that were cleanly separated from the back end, once it reaches the front end, it's no longer the same. So to illustrate things in a bit more clearly, here we have a very standard architecture for microservices team. You see that I think there are boxes. Yes, I added boxes. So down the bottom, you will see that here are your standard set of services, and each service represents a boundary. So in this example, sorry, it's not YouTube. I did not have time to make my own diagram. But there's products, a basket, and a payment, but each is very secluded into its own responsibility. But whereas when you look up to the top, the front end team and also the aggregation layer, if you have one, like a BFF layer using GraphQL, if you want to use something fancy, everything is one big blob. There is no separation. The solution, but sorry to disappoint, this might be not the solution that fits you, but it's something that we've seen sort of works. A good place to start is ubiquitous language. Has anyone heard of the words ubiquitous language? Obviously, Santosh has. Yes? No? Oh, cool! Yay! And a lot of people who don't know ubiquitous language. So ubiquitous, let's just look at the words to start with. So ubiquitous means everywhere. You can find it everywhere. And language is just a method of communicating with each other. So it's a language that is everywhere. The DDD definition, the domain-driven design definition, I ripped it off Martin Fowler's blog, so I hope it's somewhat reputable. But it's the practice of building up a common, rigorous language between developers and users. And developers and users, but everyone really. So your product managers, designers, content designers, anyone who does some form of testing, your customer support team, but making sure that this common language is actually common and it's not just in one developer's brain. So there are a few misconceptions of ubiquitous language. If you're a long-time DDDer, maybe you might have these, or maybe I just made them up. I don't know. You tell me. So the first one is ubiquitous language should only be used in the backend, because the backend holds all the business logic. Everything needs to be tested in the backend. It needs to use the correct word. It should only be used in the domain layer. This is where the heart of what complexity is, right? It's all in the domain, and it only exists within the business logic. So I'm here to tell you, no. So that is not the case. We can bring ubiquitous language into the front end. So commit to one shared language, at least one that is shareable, across the front end and back end teams. If the language collides, then pick a word that suits things, like make a compromise and toss a coin, and however other way you like to make decisions in your organization. But one word that to represent one thing, at least just in the front end, even if in the back end there's a million ways to represent it, if you pick one word to stick with in the front end, then that is a very good place to start. So at least even your front end engineers aren't confused. Be ruthless in refactors and renaming. So do not be scared to rename, okay? The best time to rename is now. It actually is. The more words you add to your code base, it's only going to go downhill from there. And there is, if you have automated tests and great coverage, this will only make you more confident in your renaming and your refactors. So never hesitate to rename. Do it in your next pull request. But last but not least, you can also use a tool like Contextive. So Chris Simon's tool that he showed earlier, it will help your team build the practice of using the same language. So yeah, it'll pop up when you hover. You can see immediately what not to use versus what to use when you type the wrong thing in, which is handy. Yay, so this is the end goal, a world where language is ubiquitous. And all your developers could smile like SpongeBob. Cool. So some other ideas, am I over time? Some other ideas to explore. So these are ways that you may try to align your front end code with your backend boundaries. The first one's very obvious. I feel like any team that uses at least React or something with a reusable bit of HTML would have done something like a component library. So looking back at our YouTube example, if we were to break this down into components, it might look something like this. As you can see, there are so many boxes around so many things, and each of these things could be shoved in a library called, not Atlas Kit, wrong one, common or components, cool components to be reused throughout your organization. You have a tile, for example, and for the box there with the video icon, and also the little footer with all of the information about a video in this example. The search bar will be its own thing. But you can see that there are so many things that need to be pieced together. So back to this diagram, we remember that the front end is one big blob, right? It's technically a monolith. So it still will end up as spaghetti because you have so many different things to pull and put together onto one page. Next slide. What was the next slide? Go on. Okay. So component libraries don't always work. We assume that each component is reusable. So you make it as flexible as you can, right? And it's like, oh, but what if they do this scenario and this scenario? What if the video is unavailable? What if the video is, I don't know, semi-popular and got a boost? What if it's an ad? You will need to coordinate between the owners of that component if it's another team. And because you have to coordinate with them, you have to understand the contract of that component. You have to ask them, hey, what does this shape mean? What data do you need? And then you have to go and find that data from what API do I need to call? Then you have to understand again the words, the language of what was returned from that API. And then you match it up to the contract. Oh, it needs to be in this shape. It only takes this. And this is where you get the complexity. You are trying to understand someone else's abstraction. And that's when the component actually does the job you want. Most of the time, it won't do your job, and you'll copy paste it to your own repo and your own version, which we did sometime recently. So not every component fits the requirements anyway. So why is it a great idea still? And in the end, you will still have the problem of messy language. And that is the problem that we want to eradicate. Another thing to think about is micro front ends. Yay! Has anyone heard of micro front ends before? Wow, buzzword. I'm kidding. Is this a micro front end? Yeah. Technically it is. I mean, it's a standalone thing, right? Is it a micro front end? Maybe. Okay, keep your thoughts for after the talk. We can chat. But with a micro front end architecture, we have clear vertical slices of ownership. The front end, I would like to say components for now. The front end components are owned, deployed, maintained, built by the same teams that deal with the backend and all the way down to the database. You have really smart engineers in your team. Don't worry, they can do it all. Because there are such vertical slices, there is a greater chance of you containing the language within your vertical slice. You will not have to care about the language of the team next to yours. The suggestions, what part of YouTube doesn't have to care about subscriptions? Subscriptions doesn't have to care about accounts. You don't have to care about piecing these together. There is no front-end team. So before it was one ball of mud, but now there are just verticals. So remember our bunch of components that we broke up? With micro front ends, it might look something like this. I press next, come on. Did I press next? Yay, this. So one whole team can own the suggestions area. Another team can own the subscriptions, search, other sidebar components, accounts, notifications, and they will own the deployment of this component. And then you just have one piece of technology to stitch all of them together, and there you go. Each component is standalone, retrieves its own data, doesn't have to depend on others. Yes, but if anyone has actually used micro front ends, I'd love to chat after and get your opinions on it. I haven't personally used it, but this sounded cool, and I think it is a step in the right direction of maintaining ubiquitous language within your context, within the boundary. So to sum things up, use the same language in the front end as the language used in the back end. I think that one's simple enough, right? Just don't make up new words. And secondly, and lastly, structure or try to structure front-end modules to align with back-end modules so that they could use the same language. It's really hard to try make the language the same when things are very jumbled up. But if your teams and your code is structured in a vertical slice, it might be just easier to do that. Yay, that is all. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, you can find me on any social media. I probably will have an account. TikTok's there as well if you're interested. Yeah, and LinkedIn's the other obvious one. And yeah, let's have a chat. Questions after, I guess.
We do have a few minutes now.
Oh, okay, cool.
There's any
Yes,
questions?
I saw your hand being raised.
Should business users not be involved in coming up with the language?
Oh, definitely. But business users?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
just
like,
users?
Let's say different divisions that you mentioned, customer support, project managers, content creators. So should they not be involved in coming up with the language?
They definitely should. So coming up with the ubiquitous language is a whole bigger than your team effort. It's a whole organization effort. And I think event storming is a way to help. There you go. I got the nod. Event storming is a way to help reach that knowledge, like the language. So there's a lot of interviewing. So what are some techniques to come up with your ubiquitous language? Lots of interviews, lots of talking with the users, lots of talking with your business stakeholders, finding out what the one term used by everyone is, and finding out the variations of a term as well. So like the example that we saw about YouTube, suggestions, recommendations, there's probably, if you open up a thesaurus, you'll see more, right? But sticking to one is the most important, like the word that mostly resonates with everyone. And you just got to make that decision as an organization, which is hard, very hard. Atlassian's like 10,000 people, I don't know, like impossible. Yeah, but smaller companies, startups, more of a chance, yeah.
With micro frontends, right? There still needs to be like a layer that stitches everything together. So like, how do you handle that?
Yeah.
Like, how does vertical teams handle that? Because you still need someone to understand the spaghetti.
Yep. So they're not really understanding spaghetti. They're just understanding this A, B, C, and D, and they go into the right side of the page, the left side of the page, the bottom side of the page, and chuck it out. So it's more of like a platform functionality rather than a product team, because all your product teams are responsible for each section of a page, but the piecing together is just anyone technical or a technical team, theoretically. That's what the internet said. And that's how I imagine it to be as well. But yes, micro front-end people, let's have a chat. Is there a question at the back? Yes.
Yes.
Hi.
Very good presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question about the components and a bit of design, the front end. Recently, I have found atomic concept or design on the front end. And have you heard about this? And if not, maybe you can recommend our other approaches to design the front end stuff.
Oh, what's atomic front end?
It was basically where the atom is the smallest part, and
Mhm.
it should be components from atoms. So basically, this is what you said, but
Yep.
that was what someone else called this atomic design.
It's the dirt.
It's the it's the basics. Yeah, so I think there are two types of components. The first one are just purely UI related. So things like your buttons, checkboxes, form components, different headings, where you just put some text and it's magically like done, right? So those type of components, I think, are what atomic components refer to, and anyone could reuse them. There's like material UI, that's an example of a component library, just take things and use it. But the components that are referred to here is more like product components. So a subscription card that you could reuse across YouTube. Will it always work? Haha. From what we've seen, it doesn't. We end up copying and pasting the whole thing again. So it's about the composition of the atomic components, adding some layer of data to it from some other service, maybe having some checks and validation on things if it's a form of some sort, and displaying something meaningful to the user and not just like the buttons. Yeah, but let's have a chat. I want to hear more of your thoughts after this. Nice. Thank you for the questions. Is that it?
Yeah, so-
Did I do my job?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.